Hi, Steve.
G'day, Oliver. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well. What time of the day is it with you again?
5 p.m. So
Oh,
not
oh,
too
that's
bad.
quite. Yeah, no, that's quite humane. Yeah,
Yeah, it is.
absolutely.
Well, thank you for taking the time to speak to me in what is your designated writing time. I appreciate how valuable that time is to a writer.
That's okay because you were willing to postpone this until now. We're actually heading off on a family vacation this week in a couple of hours, so it's one of those
Oh, wow.
weird times that I wasn't. It is my writing time, but I didn't have very high hopes for it, and seemed like an ideal time to do something fun and
Something like this.
conversation. So,
Fair
yeah.
enough, mate. Where are you off to for your holiday?
We're just going from the north of England to Wales. So it's the distances are not very large compared to the distances between us now,
Oh,
but
yeah.
it's sort
You,
of, you know,
yeah, you guys are privileged over in the UK and Europe. You know, if you want to go for a weekend getaway to Mykonos in Greece, it's a 2-hour flight, whereas for us, 2 hours gets us to Sydney. So
yeah, hold on. Right. My microphone, I should be using the proper microphone now. Let's see. Okay. Yeah.
yeah, that
Great.
sounds good.
Great.
Fantastic. And how's the season of? I saw you're watching Succession. I haven't seen a single episode, so do you recommend it?
I do. It gets a little bit unremitting. The people and the characters are so sort of spiritually empty at a certain point. It feels kind of overwhelming, but it's so well written and very, very funny. And yeah,
Okay.
no, it's great.
Okay. Well, I'll definitely invest some time into it. And time is something that we're here to talk about today. I was lucky enough to get an early copy of 4,000 Weeks, and as someone who's read extensively on these topics of, quote unquote time management, and I know it's probably not the best term for it, but that is in the byline, 4,000 Weeks, time management for mortals.
Totally.
And, I've published numerous books and articles on the topic. And yet, despite all of that, 4,000 Weeks to me stood out as a unique take on time management. And to put that into perspective, and I'll throw a question your way and we'll get the ball rolling. But I came across a LinkedIn post recently, and the poster was waxing enthusiastic about the value of play and how as children we know how to play, but as we get older we forget to play. And as someone who's a surfer and whatnot, I love that sentiment. But they finished off this comment with ultimately saying that, and if we learn how to play, then we'll ultimately become more productive. Which, why does it always have to be about being more productive, Oliver?
Yeah, it's such an interesting question because I think that's true, right? I think the claim made in that post is a correct claim.
Mm-hmm.
But there is something wrong, I think, with that being the sort of fundamental motivating reason for doing it. And actually, the one way to not have something play be more cause more productivity in your life is to be pursuing it for the reason that it will make you more productive in your life. I think that, to me, this is part of a broader, deeper thing that we do with time all the time, which is to sort of completely instrumentalize it, right? To sort of to treat the value of any hour solely in terms of where it's leading us. Definitely like a thing that I have suffered from and continue to suffer from in my life, because books like this are always written, they're always the advice that the author needs to hear. So yeah, I think there's something intrinsic to, especially to things like play and rest, that it's just not, it doesn't, if it's not for itself, then it isn't really play, and you are instead postponing the real value of life to some later moment, so that the value of, like, I don't know what it would be, spending an hour swimming in a river somewhere or something, would entirely be measured by whether 2 days later you were sort of being more productive in your work. Well, no, the value should be in the experience itself. Otherwise you end up like missing the whole of life waiting for these future
Absolutely.
moments.
Well, it'd be pretty sad if if we looked back on that swim in the river and said, well, what a waste of time that was, because I got absolutely 0% more work done this week versus last week. And you know, the value of just
Right, yes. But the huge irony I always find is that if you can let that drop a little bit and see that the value has to be in the present, in almost all cases, you actually will end up being more productive as well, right? So it's not a zero sum. It's not actually about choosing a relaxed life over a productive one.
yeah,
You get to have both, but you don't get to have both unless you make some effort to sort of be in the moment of it. Yeah.
absolutely. And it's interesting too. I mean, I spent many years working in the corporate world before I bounced about 9 years ago to pursue entrepreneurship. And one thing I observed in that world was so many people just eating lunch at their desks, and you know, as if that was going to make them more productive. But by virtue of not taking that time away from their desks, by not taking time to rest physically, cognitively, arguably they would be less productive in the afternoon. But it seems like there's this sort of fallacy. And I think in the corporate world, it probably has a little bit to do with face and showing that I'm at my desk versus say going missing for an hour and coming back and being more productive, but people thinking, where's Oliver gone? I haven't seen him for a while.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think you're totally right that a lot of it does have to do with sort of presenteeism and wanting to give the right display. I think internally, for me anyway, like what underscores all of that kind of urge to be ever more efficient with time is this kind of unspoken, maybe for some people as unconscious notion that you're like heading towards some future state of being on top of everything and being in control of everything, right? So it's like the reason that you're racing through lunch at your desk is because if you keep doing that and you keep finding more and more productivity techniques, then like in the best case scenario, everything will get handled in your life. And in the worst case, you'll at least keep your head above water. And I think that sort of goes to the core fallacy, right? Because the what's really going on, I would want to say, is like there's always going to be an infinite amount of things you could be doing with your time. To-do lists don't stop. To-do lists go on forever. And so leaning into the future with that sort of implication that, you know, if I can only hurry my lunch and work an extra hour here and get up an hour earlier, then I will finally get to that phase of life where it's all in working order. Actually, much more effective to surrender that and just focus on, you know, what's the most effective and interesting and meaningful thing I could do right now.
Well, that's reminiscent of Carl Jung, and you quote him in the book, which is focus on the next most necessary thing, essentially, in some respects, as opposed to getting bogged down by, you know, all the trees in the forest. Focus on the tree right in front of you. That's, you know, perhaps the biggest tree and the most important tree in your life right now. And one thing you do allude to in the book is this paradox of limitation, in the sense that the more that we try to get on top of things and have our to-do lists and use some sort of workflow management tool and all these sort of things and productivity tools to save time, the more stressful we tend to become when we're not 100% on top of things and when there's new things flowing into our inbox and so on and so on. So whereas the person, as you put it a few moments ago, that just surrenders to the fact that they have these limitations, they can only respond to so many emails in a day, is actually going to be less stressed than the person who tries to get to inbox zero.
Yeah, totally. And there's sort of absolutely, yes. And there's a couple of things going on there. I think one is this kind of Parkinson's law thing, where actually if you get really good at processing your email fast, you're going to invite much more email into your life. But it's also like, it's not sometimes, not suggesting you said this, but sometimes people think that I'm sort of making a case against all kind of planning and all goal setting or project management. And then of course, if you get into many corporate contexts and entrepreneurial contexts, it's absurd to think that you could manage with no form of planning, of scheduling, project milestones, all the rest of it. The point that I'm always trying to get across, I think, is that like even those are only present moment activities. It's not that we should only care about doing. It's not that we should only do the next the next thing and the next thing and the next thing. It's that you only can ever do the next thing and the next thing, right? So in a very sort of, to me, profound sense, all you ever have is the next moment and making the wisest decision about the next moment. And sometimes in a big, complicated organization, of course, you're going to want to use that moment to do some project planning or establish some goals and criteria for meeting the goals and all that stuff. But you're still going to relate to it as just like a thing that you're doing in that moment. And then there's something else you're doing in the next moment and something else you're doing in the next moment. And then you stop using those planning tools psychologically to try to exert a kind of control over the future that actually we don't get to exert as finite human beings. I'm interested, you mentioned being a surfer, and I'm certainly not a surfer, but the surfing metaphor comes up again and again and again in a lot of the best writing on this as a mindset and a body set, obviously, when you're actually doing it, that is not just kind of like improvisationally, like going in a sort of loosey-goosey way through life, but is completely responsive to every moment. There's no point trying to plan in that kind of really top-down way how a wave is going to go. If I don't know, I'm at the limits of my ability to talk about surfing now, but you know, that metaphor of responding in the moment to things, and as a result, doing something that is planned, like it's an outcome you want. It's not, it's not like, oh, I don't care what happens in my life, but it is also is not something that can involve sort of fixing the future. And it's obvious, I guess, in the context of surfing, but it's still true in the context of building a business. It's just that we are able to fool ourselves otherwise.
Yeah, and I think we can probably take the analogy a touch further. Like, as you said, you're not suggesting throw out the planning and the project management tools and all that sort of stuff. If I'm going surfing, I'll have a look at, you know, the surf report. I'll see how big the waves are going to be. Is the wind coming in from the right direction? Is it a northerly or a southerly wind, and so on? And so that's kind of the planning. If all of those factors align, then I know that I'm more likely to catch a wave. But once I'm out there in the surf, as you put it, once that wave comes in, I don't know, every wave is different essentially. And once that wave comes in, once I catch it, I'm present in the moment, rolling with the punches. And I suppose that's part of the reason why surfers love it so much, because it does ground you in the present moment, like, you know, few other things do. And particularly for people who perhaps find themselves struggling to find that space of presence in their day-to-day, they just gravitate to things like that. And for other people, it could be other things. I mean, for some people, for a lot of people, I mean, for all of us to some extent, sex is one of those few things that we experience that really grounds us in the present moment, which is perhaps why it's such a popular pastime.
Yeah, no. And I mean, I think, I don't know how much this applies to the sex example, but certainly to the surfing example. And I know other people who do sort of kind of, I'm thinking about climbers and people like that. I feel like there is this kind of, this is sort of an unproven pet theory of mine, that basically everybody has a meditation practice. It's just that not everyone thinks of it as a meditation practice, right? People gravitate towards activities that require this kind of presence in the moment, because something in us knows that it is like deeply freeing and meaningful and refreshing to do that. I think surfing and meditation is actually a pretty long-standing alliance there. But I know people who sort of like, you know, climb mountains who would be totally scornful of the idea of sitting on a cushion and closing their eyes for 15 minutes in the morning, but they're basically doing the same thing psychologically, is my theory, right? They're finding the thing that requires their full presence in the only actual moment of time that they have.
Absolutely. And I think it's probably important to note that, you know, to find that presence, it doesn't require us to climb mountains or go surfing or, you know, have sex or whatever. It could just be noticing things in the moment, you know, just being more mindful. If you're having a conversation with someone, of perhaps your innate triggers and reactions, and that in and of itself is a form of meditation that's grounding you in the present moment. And you can find that.
No, absolutely. Yes. It can be really anything. One thing I found really interesting in that, I'm just thinking about it at the moment, which is why it comes to my mind, is like, I'm pretty good at not multitasking in a kind of gross way. You're not going to find me kind of very often trying to answer an email while reading a book, because I don't know. But the temptation to kind of fill spare attentional channels, to sort of listen to music when you're going running, to put something on in the background when you're tidying up your office or something. Nothing wrong with it, but it's really an interesting practice to try to not do it, to actually not create those kind of background distractions and just sort of be with whatever you're doing. Surprisingly uncomfortable sometimes, but also rewarding.
Yeah, I think this probably hits at a central sort of through line in your book, which is discomfort. And a lot of the work that we do, we pursue in order to avoid ourselves in some respect. In fact, I think it was Nietzsche, I've got the quote here somewhere, where he said that haste is universal because everyone is in flight from himself. And so we run from one thing to another. If we feel that sense of discomfort creeping in, we pick up our phones. You see people all the time at the traffic lights, the light's red. Oh no, what do I do for all of 17 seconds? Let me quickly pick up my phone and see if anyone's tagged me on Instagram. And to your point, and I've tried it, and I tried to incorporate it into my week, at least for 30 minutes a week, where I just try and sit with no distractions, no music, no book, no phone, no nothing. It is one of the hardest things I have had to do as a human being. And when I propose others try to do it, they're like, "No, man, that sounds sounds scary." Right.
Well, as you'll know, and as I also mentioned in the book, there are studies suggesting that people would rather give themselves electric shocks than just wait in a room. If you put people on their own in a room with nothing to do but deliver sort of painful but safe electric shocks to themselves, they will choose to do that, just to especially men will choose to do that. Actually, it's in a higher proportion than just sit doing nothing. But yeah, even just doing one thing, which ought to be easier than doing nothing, right, is it's a real challenge. It's to sort of to focus on a specific activity without filling up all the other channels of attention. And I'm perpetually fascinated by how serious that discomfort feels, given how obviously easy it is really to lean into it and to weather it and come out the other end. Like, it's not actually difficult to, load the dishwasher without putting on some music in the background or something, but it feels like it is.
Yeah. I mean, how much of that discomfort would you say is proportional to people's, I suppose, lack of self-work, if I'm to use that word, or perhaps just a pent-up trauma that's, from childhood, and all these discomfort and, breakups and relationships that have fallen apart, and all these emotions that people are holding on to that they usually try and numb themselves with through socializing, through drink, through sex, through surfing, through work, and never having really processed that stuff. I would imagine that if someone has gone to the extent to try and at least get more comfortable with themselves as human beings and all of their baggage, that sitting still doing nothing or doing one thing wouldn't be as uncomfortable as it is for someone that refuses to, say, sit still for 5 minutes and try to meditate, for example.
Yeah, totally. I think that's right. I mean, I think in all of this material, we're sort of tacking between certain kind of timeless universal truths and then certain truths that get their specific tone from, the stuff that an individual person has been through. So, I'm quoting the psychotherapist Bruce Tift here, but like, we all sort of rail against the feeling of being imprisoned by reality. And that's going to take on a different, most of us have probably got some kind of legacy of our upbringing that implies that if we just relaxed into the moment, that would be bad somehow, that it would be unsafe, or that other people would be cross with us, or that we wouldn't sufficiently sort of be proving ourselves to earn our right to exist, all sorts of different things. And then I imagine that for people who are unlucky enough to have suffered kind of really severe forms of trauma, that is just sort of doubled and tripled. At the same time, it is sort of a human universal, right? And so in the book, I'm more looking at the universal part than the specific, but like, part of what you have to face if you just sort of enter into the moment of time is that you are just this sequence of moments in time, and that life is just finite, and you don't get to say like, well, in a few years' time, I'll get my life together to such an extent that forevermore I can be happy and successful, because there isn't a forevermore for any of us, right? So,
Yeah.
that sort of more philosophical way of thinking about it would focus on the sort of finitude being scary for everyone. But then I think, yeah, I think the more that you've sort of looked into why you find finitude scary, the more it's going to be possible to coexist with it. Yeah.
Absolutely. And yeah, we are definitely on borrowed time, as you put it in the book. And one thing the Romans practiced was this idea of memento mori, which meant effectively remember that you will die. And
Yeah.
I remember reading a book from an Australian palliative care nurse called Bronnie Ware. The book was called The Five Regrets of the Dying.
Oh yeah.
And she had ushered thousands of people into whatever comes after this life. And essentially one of the biggest regrets was wishing I hadn't worked so much. But through time, I mean, going back to 1930, when John Maynard Keynes said, in the future, technology will give us productivity gains so that we don't have to work more than 15 hours a week. And we had those gains, but we just reinvest the time savings into more gains. Despite the fact that there's so much literature out there on people saying on their deathbeds that they wish they hadn't worked so much. So what's driving this? Is this just the growth imperative that organizations and nations have, or is this the distraction that people feel that drives them to just keep working? I imagine it's not a false dichotomy. It's probably, that's a false dichotomy. I imagine it's both and other things. So why do you think we're just glued to our work for 40, 50, in some cases, 60 plus hours a week?
Yeah, I think it's so interesting and sort of scary. And, you know, I'll sound a bit like a stuck record, but to me, I always want to say that the sort of the deepest root cause is just like it's a reaction to the situation of being finite. We sort of, on some deep level don't want to die, don't want to think that this is the life we have, this moment now is the life we have to make the best use of if we're ever going to live a meaningful life. And so we sort of gravitate towards anything that we can sort of corral into that project of turning life into a process of getting somewhere. Now, on top of that, you then get like capitalism, right? It's like there are huge forces that massively reinforce this, so that even if you personally aren't like that and don't want to live in that way, it can feel like you don't really have any option but to live in that way. And then you start to people start to get their sense of self-worth from their work, and so you get this sort of strange mixture of people feeling like they're obliged to work really hard just to stay afloat, and that's kind of true on some level, but on the other hand also deriving their sense of self-worth from it, so they're sort of collaborating with the socioeconomic situation. And it happens at all levels, right? It's like at the level of absolute poverty, it's very easy to see that someone sort of does have to just work all the time in order to keep food on the table. But it doesn't feel less imperative to somebody on a much higher salary than that they need to do it, because the things that they consider to be the conditions of a happy life in their life do cost that amount of money, and you do want to pay the mortgage to live in the house that you live in and everything. So there is this kind of like ratcheting effect that's often been observed. I don't think we can get free of it completely, short of, extraordinary kind of revolutionary political change or something. What I do think is that there's something very powerful in sort of seeing it for what it is, and not imagining that at the end of that process is where happiness lies, that actually happiness and meaning can be found right in the midst of it. And then it's like, it's not like you then suddenly don't have to pay your rent, but you don't have to put all of your existential energy into the idea that once you've reached the next level of wealth or the next promotion or the next stage of work accomplishment, like that's when real life gets to begin.
Yeah. Well,
That
that's
makes
the
sense.
I guess we always end up back on the hedonic treadmill that, ultimately
Yeah,
we
right.
might get that pay rise, or we might get an investment from a venture capital firm for our startup, whatever the case is, and we might celebrate that and
Right.
feel great for a week, but essentially we always revert back to our sort of baseline level of emotional sort of regulation, and the way we feel subjectively on a day-to-day basis doesn't change all that much. And then we find ourselves thinking, well, we got that Series A round of capital. Now we got to get that Series B round. It's going to be bigger and better. It's
Yeah.
going to help us do better things. And it never stops.
Yeah.
Then
And, on some level, I always want to say, like, nothing wrong with that, right? Nothing wrong with the attitude that says, I'm someone who thrives on this kind of excitement, and I've just had some of it, and now let's go looking for the next one. That's fine. I think you point to a downside of that, which is the idea that it always has to escalate so that it's a terrible problem if at some point you encounter a big failure, or almost worse in a way, not a big failure, but it just becomes steady and normal, and like there's no sort of exciting new layers of growth. That's a problem. Thinking that, like, that's when the meaning of life is finally going to arrive is a problem. But actually, if you can let go of some of that kind of future focus, some of that premising of that, some of that making the present conditional on the future, it's not that you're then going to walk away from your from your startup or from your work trying to get investments in your organization. It's the opposite in some ways, right? It's that you can just do that freely because it's fun, and your personality is that of someone who finds that exciting and meaningful, without this huge burden of like, and eventually it's going to kind of justify my existence or something.
Yeah. And but I think that's absolutely right. And my point is that not pursuing that Series A or B or C round of capital because you think that's going to make you enough as a person. And that's because ultimately, I think as a human being, if I can derive my self-worth from myself and not based on external things, then it will change my relationship with work. I might still want to be an entrepreneur who wants to raise $1 billion and build $100 billion company and do all that stuff. Or I might realize that actually I was only pursuing that line of work for the validation that I needed as a human being. But now that I've got that validation from somewhere else, from within myself, realizing that I don't need all these external accolades to feel content within my own skin, then suddenly I don't want to be an entrepreneur. Maybe I want to go and work on philanthropic pursuits or something to that effect.
Sure. Yeah. Right. No, absolutely. Maybe you do. Maybe you. Yeah. Right. It clarifies why you're doing the thing you're doing, and then for some people, not doing it anymore is going to be the right way forward. I think, and I also just think like it's sort of like the biggest secret hidden productivity technique in the world is not totally needing to do the thing that you're trying to do, right? Like it's like when you don't feel, or at least if you can go some way down this road, when you don't feel that your self-worth or the fate of your life or the world or whatever is riding on your doing the thing you're doing, then you're free to just do it, right? Because then it becomes a form of play, I guess, just to get back to our opening conversation. And that's when you do it. And certainly in my life, that's always like the one thing that is going to make it really hard for me to get a chapter written or anything like that is a sort of overburdening sense that I absolutely have to, or bad things will happen, right? That's just terrible.
Yeah.
It works for maybe an hour of kind of, you can squeeze out a bit of under duress, but that's not the way to like let the energy flow to the activity.
Absolutely. I guess it's like a lot of arbitrary deadlines that people have in their calendars and meetings that don't really need to happen and things of that sort. But talking about the capitalist growth imperative that you kind of touched on earlier, and how people may not feel like they have any control and ability to work in a more sort of values aligned way. Some of this, I suppose, comes back to leaders of organizations. One that comes to mind is 37 Signals. So Jason Fried and David Hannemeyer Hansen. So their whole thing is not raising venture capital so that they're not privy to, or they're not basically part of this machine that's chasing 100x returns. And they've got,
Right.
venture capitalists knocking on their door saying, hey guys, you've got to grow faster. Let's raise some more money. Let's get you some more employees. They have about 35 employees. They've had that for a number of years. They generate tens of millions, but they're a private company with no external investment. During the summer months, they work for 32 hours a week. If anybody wants to work beyond that, they can, but they're not expected to. And so
Right.
they have this sort of approach that they call a calm company, which I suppose is in stark contrast to your VC-backed startup. It's also in stark contrast to, say, large consulting firms, law firms, accounting firms, and things like that, where people are typically working 70 to 80 hours a week. So I suppose there's something in that for entrepreneurs and leaders and executives listening to this in terms of leading by example, and when it comes to creating more humane work environments, I suppose.
Yeah, no, I think I don't have an awful lot to add to that. I think it's absolutely right, and I think I've really admired from a distance what the Basecamp 37 Signals people are doing. I guess there's just one thing to sort of add on to that is what the role is for people who are in a position of influence and leadership, but not actually not quite so completely in control of a company that they can decide that it's not going to grow. And I think there's a lot to be done there just modeling this kind of way of being as well, right? It's just like not pretending that you yourself don't have any bandwidth limits, or that you expect the people who report to you to demonstrate no bandwidth limits, to be willing to have, this is more sort of Cal Newport territory, but to be willing to have that conversation that says like, okay, I want the team to focus on this for the next month. So that means not focusing on these other things, right? So it's like, here are the things that you can backpedal, slow, whatever the word is. Here are the things you can put on the back burner, because something always has to be on the back burner if something is going to be on the front burner, and so on and so on. Yeah, just sort of, a calm company, but just also just like a sort of a company that occupies the world of reality.
Yeah. Well said. One thing that I suppose we've talked about people who perhaps work, let's just say too much, probably not the best way to put it, but that might lend listeners to think that the alternative is just traveling the world all the time, climbing mountains, going surfing, doing all these things in order to live a full life. But even there, something you allude to in the book is that we're still going to embrace or run into constraints. What can you tell us about that sort of idea of this bottomless bucket list, and how it doesn't matter what we do, we're facing constraints with the 4,000 weeks that we have on this earth?
Yeah. I mean, I think that it's a risk, isn't it, that you sort of, because we live in a very work-focused culture, and there's a sort of an endlessness to the feeling of work for many people, there is this sense that like, if you're going to repudiate that, then you can just switch into trying to live a completely extraordinary, like limit-defying life in some different way. And there's some sense of the idea of defying limits, which I think is good and right and fine. I don't want to criticize, but no, if it is that notion that you're going to get to do a very large proportion of all the cool things there are to do in the world, there's actually something sort of flawed in that too, as you indicate, which is that experiences are also limitless. There is, if you set out to get to the place where you feel like you've really seen most of the world, or you've had most of the experiences that the world has to offer. Firstly, you'll never get there, because that's just a total mismatch between our finite nature and the world that we're in. But also you'll live again back into that same like collector mindset, that sort of future oriented thing about like, have I got enough of these under my belt yet? And you'll always feel that there are more to do than when you started. And I think this relates also to this sense of this notion that the way to find a meaning in life has to be extraordinary, right? To do things that are very unusual, to spend a lot of your time doing sort of extreme or unusual and extraordinary things. Might be your personality that you want to do that, but I think that it sort of misses the point to think that that's what makes things meaningful. I've never been able to track it down again, but I found an anecdote ages and ages ago, which was from a piece of journalism that was following a bunch of like super rich people on some kind of organized tour. It was just like 10 or 20 people on a sort of extremely sort of very, very, very high end international guided journey through various like fascinating locations in the world, and seeing some anecdote about how actually the favorite part of it was being stuck in some airport lounge for 3 hours for some reason, where they all just got to chat with each other and like slow down and be a group instead of constantly trying to vacuum up experience. And the big irony being, of course, that it didn't need to particularly be a premium airport lounge. They could just have all like gone to a bar or something. And I think there's something important in that, right? That actually a lot of what makes life meaningful is how you're sharing an experience with other people rather than the specific content of the experience.
Yeah,
Anyway,
and
that was a
I
long
guess
answer. Sorry.
no, that's great. And I think for a lot of people, their equivalent of that luxury airport lounge might have been the first few months of the pandemic lockdowns, where
Oh, that's a really good point. Yes. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
like I love the
Yeah. No.
first few months, not on the rest of it, but the first few months are great.
Well, no, absolutely. I think that's a surprisingly common experience. I know it was very different where you are, and I've always assumed that it was not like that where you are. But yeah, I think you come across that sort of guilty admission in all sorts of contexts, don't you? That when you're sort of forced to stop and just be with your family or your backyard or your neighborhood where that was an option. You suddenly realize that actually, yeah, the sources of value in your life are not what you necessarily thought they were.
Absolutely. And I think another example might just be when people get to hop on an airplane for a long haul flight, 12 hours, no internet, can't check email, can kind of just chill out with a book. A lot of, ambitious, hard driving people love that because it gives them an opportunity to just check out that perhaps they don't afford themselves that liberty, when they are within, the reach of a Wi-Fi signal, essentially.
Yeah.
But another thing you bring up in the book, Oliver, is on this idea that we're insignificant, and in the broader context of space and time and the ever-expanding universe, we absolutely are. And I think this can definitely create a sense of freedom. But at the same time, to me, it feels like there's a fine line between that sense of freedom and a sense of sort of self-destructive nihilism and pointlessness creeping in. Like, how do you reconcile that idea that we're insignificant with not letting your life go to absolute crap?
Yeah, really good question. Because there is that sort of lifting of a burden when you think like, oh, hang on, 200 years from now, 100 years from now, that is very often a week from now, the decision that I'm tormenting myself with is not going to matter. And that kind of there's that kind of freedom to just like, well, I might as well just do what I want to do. And I do think some people have the opposite response, which is not, well, I might as well do what matters to me, but what's the point in doing what matters to me? I really like a way of thinking about this that comes from a philosopher called Ido Landau, who I do quote in the book as well. There's something about the sort of nihilistic person that they sort of flatter themselves that they are facing the hard truths of the universe, right? They're saying like nothing matters. But Landau points out that in a weird way, a nihilist in that context is kind of still clinging on to a particular kind of idealistic fantasy. So they're still saying that the meaning of life would come from, a meaningful life would be doing something that, creating a legacy that lived for all eternity, doing something that changed the whole world in some huge, very significant way. And so they're like, the nihilist is like the idealist in that sense. But then the difference is that they're saying, and we can't do it, therefore life's completely pointless. And Landau's point is just like, why adopt this standard of meaning in the first place, right? Why say that a meaningful life is one that the criterion for a meaningful life is something that is beyond the capability of human beings to do, right? Which is to create legacies that last absolutely literally forever. Some few people have legacies that last thousands of years, and a few more have legacies that last hundreds of years. But like this notion that it only matters if it's cosmically significant, the problem there is in the standard that you're adopting, not in the human life that can't measure up to it. And he has these wonderful lines where he's like, if someone tells you like they really love their dog and they think their dog's amazing, you don't start haranguing them because their dog can't drive. And if if you've got a really nice chair that's very comfortable to sit on, you don't feel negative towards it because it's no good for boiling water for a cup of tea, right? These are just like things that those things are not supposed to do, and they still have their own meaning and merit and existence. And in the same way, if humans are not supposed to be the kind of animal that can like do something that is going to last forever, or automatic, or that most of us can expect to do something that affects the lives of millions and millions of people, maybe we can't, like, fine, that doesn't need to be the standard of meaning. The standard of meaning can be much more in the present, on the scale of a life, on the scale of a neighborhood, on the scale of a family, or for businesses it could be doing something really important for a few thousand people, and there's just no reason to start from the perspective of like setting the bar so absurdly high that almost none of us can meet it.
Absolutely.
That
And I
would be
think
my response.
that's a great response. I think our perspective and framing matters a lot. Like, for example, a couple of garbage cleaners might think that what they do is pretty low down the rungs of society and not all that meaningful, but ultimately they're keeping our streets clean so that kids and everyone else has somewhere to play that's clean and sanitarious, and it's not going to result in people picking up all sorts of diseases like the cholera outbreak that we had in London in, I think it was the 1850s and whatnot. Like, that is actually a really important role that they serve in society, and it's a matter of seeing yourself as that, as opposed to just a garbo who collects the bins at 5 a.m. or whatever it is.
Yeah.
So
I love the Australian abbreviation of all words.
garbo.
Sorry,
It's always either an O, Oliver, at the end, or an as, like Shaz for Sharon or something like that.
Okay.
So
too busy to say the whole word. Yeah.
Yeah. It's there's this African American comedian based in Australia, and he has this joke, and it's about how Australians have this. There's this vernacular where we say, "That's cool as," and he's like, "Cool as what? I don't know. I got shit to do." That's all we don't finish the sentence. But one thing I wanted to ask you, Oliver, on I love the book, and it's definitely reoriented in some ways my relationship with my own work to some degree. And I over the past few years, I've definitely leaned into this idea that work can be a crutch, and trying to be more cognizant of that when I am using it as a crutch. And your books definitely put the exclamation mark on that idea. But at the same time, that kind of takes the mask off in a way where I tend to get a sense of guilt or pressure when I'm sitting at my desk for more than, say, 4 or 5 hours, and this creeping sense that I should be doing something else, and that I'm spending too long staring at this box.
Right.
I should be out there cultivating relationships, or doing something a little bit more quote unquote meaningful with my life. Whereas previously, work is a socially validated activity, and I could sit at my desk for 10 hours and not feel any guilt at all about that. So it's this paradox of sorts, if you will.
Well, yeah, I think it's interesting that I know what you mean, and I have experienced some of it too, I think, but I do think that the part of the way through that is to see that, like, right, it's not that it might, in any given situation, a person might be spending too much time on work and neglecting relationships, whatever, but putting that aside, putting the specifics aside, like, it's sort of baked into this whole situation that whatever you're doing, even if it's super meaningful, there are going to be some other things that you could be doing with that time that would be super meaningful that you're not doing. And this is when I'm talking in the book about like this idea of the joy of missing out or whatever. It's like you have to drop the standard that says, you know, it's only appropriate for me to be spending this hour on X if I can convince myself that it would be comparatively pointless to spend it on Y. It's like, no, they're both really meaningful, and you just have to choose one. And yeah, absolutely. If you end up choosing 12 hours a day, day after day of one and not the other, then your life is going to fall out of balance. But there is something really powerful I've found in thinking like, you know, I find this just as a parent, for example, is a very cliched example, but like, you know, if I'm working, I feel I ought to be spending time with my son. And if I'm spending time with my son, I feel like I ought to be addressing various work things that need doing. And the response to that that is most effective for me is just like, well, in a sense, yeah, sure. Like it would be totally meaningful to go and work on that chapter and to not be with my son. And it would be totally meaningful to put down the chapter and go and spend time with my son. But it's just, there's no way out of that. So all you can really hope to do is, you know, take each minute or hour or moment as it comes and hope that and course correct and follow your intuitions. But yeah, it's like that, as I say, yeah, the answer to that, like, would it be meaningful to be doing something else, is almost always yes, it would.
Yeah, it's funny. What I'm hearing here is that life is kind of like a squeeze ball when it comes to pursuing meaningful activities. You've got that relationship. Well, let's spend time with my son. Okay, squeeze that ball, then the other side pops out, and that's, well, I should be working on that chapter. Let's squeeze that. No, I should be hanging out with my son. And there's always something else.
Right. And it's like, that's how it is. But I don't think that one needs to stress about it. I still do to some extent, to be clear, but like, I don't think it's baked. That is baked into our situation, but I don't think it's baked in that needs to be a bad situation. Yeah, I guess that's what I'm saying.
Accepting what is and leaning into it, I think, which is a very sort of Buddhist
Yeah.
approach to this. In the little time we have left, Oliver, I'd love to just leave our audience with some actionable steps they can take. And, you know, we've covered a few in this conversation organically, but a couple that I suppose I'd like to double click on, which kind of related, I suppose, is one, don't work beyond a set time, and two, limit your work in progress, which kind of ties into one. Well, kind of ties into the 12-hour days we were touching on, but also, yeah, just limiting your work in progress and learning how to just say no to things. I think it's such an important skill.
Yeah, so just to contextualize both of these, I mean, I'm always at pains to say that I think any of these techniques, they can be really useful, but they are just sort of ways of trying to lead oneself more into this perspective shift that I'm trying to get at in the book, from sort of imagining that there's all the time in the world to sort of really letting finitude sink under your skin. And therefore, you know, there's all that philosophy, I think, applies to everyone, but these individual techniques, it can very often be the case that someone says like, well, that wouldn't work for me in my role. And it's like, fine. What matters is the perspective shift. But so the first of those that you mentioned, and I attribute this in large part again to Cal Newport, as I do in the book, but this idea of taking a sort of volume first approach to work, where the basic orientation you have towards your day is like, how much time do I have available? Am I willing to make available for work? Possibly you could divide that into, you know, how much time am I willing to make available for different kinds of work? And then, given those constraints, what are the most important things to put into that container that I have determined? As opposed to what we generally do otherwise, which is get up in the morning and think about all the things that need to be done, and then just like desperately try and do them. So that's a sort of task first approach that just says, well, I'm just going to have to find the time somewhere. and you won't, and that's when it all goes wrong and gets very stressful. So it's just this idea of starting off with like, well, okay, this is what I'm going to dedicate to this kind of activity, given that that's the amount of time. What should I put in there as a matter of priority? And then limiting your work in progress. I mean, in some ways, that's a way of limiting your work in progress. But what I mean specifically by limiting your work in progress is using some form of task management approach that restricts the number of things that you have actively on your plate at any one time. So anyone who's familiar with the Kanban method of workflow management will recognize this, right? You might have a list of 500 things that you on some level are doing or have committed to or want to do, but you then use some form of system to make sure that there are maybe 5 of those at any one moment that you're actually working on. And one of the very simplest ways that I talk about this in the book is you could just keep 2 to-do lists, right? You could keep an open to-do list that you just put anything and everything on whenever it comes up. It could be 400 items long. And then you keep a closed to-do list that might have 5 slots on it, and you feed tasks from the long list onto the short list. And the rule is that you can't feed another task onto the short list until you've freed up a space by completing one of them. So you're just creating a bottleneck in your sort of deliberate, conscious bottleneck in your workflow. That means that almost everything is forced to wait until a few things are done. And it's really unpleasant in certain ways and uncomfortable. And people say like, oh, I can't afford to neglect those other 20 things while I do these 5. But the fact is you're neglecting them anyway, right? And the fact is that if you can sort of take things in these little portions and see them through to completion, you need to define completion in a sensible way. You know, a chapter might be a good thing for that for me as a writer, but a book wouldn't be, because then it would just hold up the whole of the rest of my life while I tried to just finish the book. But what you find is it's actually a much quicker way of getting things done. It calls on your patience, right? Because you have to be willing to keep people waiting and be willing to keep yourself waiting in certain ways, but that the aggregate result is that things move through your system of getting things done.
And I guess by
faster.
doing that, you're also going to shield yourself from suffering the cognitive switching penalty all day long, because you're constantly switching context between 10 or more tasks, which is just exhausting you slowly but surely. And come the end of the day, you're just cognitively absolutely taxed doing that. Whereas if you only have, say, 2 or 3 tasks at any one time, you're more likely to just be a lot more focused on those tasks and not feel that sort of creeping exhaustion over the course of
I think that's absolutely right. Yeah. And I think it's all sort of, I've been constantly experimenting with how I do this in my own life. I think it does all sort of point ultimately, I think the sort of ideal state of this is just really to be very good at doing one thing at a time, and to make the choice of what you do for that one thing almost completely intuitive, right? It would just be like, well, my energies are pointing in this direction right now. This is urgent right now. And it all just comes together into a sort of, this is the one thing I will focus on right now. But that's a kind of, that feels like a little bit of a sort of Zen master level of this. And these kind of tactics that I'm talking about, I think, can act as supports for the rest of us.
Yeah, absolutely.
In doing that.
You did mention that sometimes people go into their day with the best of intentions to find time to do A, B, and C, but quickly reality sets in, and if they're not intentional about how they go about their day, they'll just fill it up with work and have no time for themselves. And I remember reading Rob Kiyosaki's Rich Dad, Poor Dad years ago, probably 15 years ago. And he's got this concept in there of pay yourself first. And of course, he's talking about money and, pay yourself first and put money into a savings account before you pay your bills and do all these other things, as opposed to paying your bills first. And he said, you do that, you'll find a way to pay those bills and you'll still have your savings. But it seems to me that same sort of concept of paying yourself first also extends to time management. And I think you also had a tweet about this a little while ago. Prioritizing time in our day, carving out an hour, 2 hours, whatever it is, to exercise, to spend time with our kids, and just guarding that time with our dear lives. I think that concept of pay yourself first is just as just as profound or just as important when it comes to time management.
Yeah, I think that's totally right. And I sort of got this notion, the idea of communicating that of that analogy from money from a creativity coach called Jessica Abel, who writes about this as well. And yeah, completely. It's like the pay yourself last. The alternative in money is premised on this illusion that if you just sort of spend on what you need to spend and you're generally sensible day after day, then at the end of the month or the end of the 2 weeks or whenever you get paid, there's going to be this pot left over that you can then put into savings. And of course, it doesn't work that way. That takes too much daily discipline. It means resisting all the forces that are sort of getting at us to spend more and more money. Likewise with time, like if you think that there's a time that's coming in the future when you're going to have all your other stuff under control, when you're not going to have a full inbox, when people aren't going to be wanting your attention, and then you get to do the thing that you feel life is really about, it's never going to come. And in fact, the real job I've slowly learned is not, you feel anxiety about all the other things that are getting in the way of the thing you want to do. The temptation is to try to get rid of the anxiety by doing all those other things. In fact, the real skill to be learned, I think, is tolerating that anxiety and meanwhile doing the thing that you really want to do. So that could be, spend half an hour in the morning writing your novel, spend time nurturing a relationship, even though there's lots of emails to be answered, and just do it in an incremental way. Do it for a few minutes and see what happens. And if the sky doesn't fall in when you leave the other things a little bit longer, then you'll have learned something useful. The only thing you mustn't do is say this sounds like a really good tactic that these two guys are discussing on this podcast. So in a couple of months, when everything else in my life is under control, then I'll try implementing it. The mind is very sneaky in that.
Yes, indeed it is. Indeed it is, Oliver. Well, that's a beautiful place to end this conversation. I really appreciate your time today. If people want to connect with you, they can follow you on Twitter at Oliver Burkeman. They can find your books over at oliverburkeman.com. And I think if anything, people should listen to this. And I think the one thing to take out of this conversation is just to accept more of what is, as opposed to try and push away all the anxiety and limitations of life, and just lean into it, because that's all we can really do at the end of the day. And with that, there comes a sense of freedom.
Stop thinking about life as like a problem you've got to solve, and just think of exactly. It's like and just show up for where you actually are. Exactly.
Just be it rather than just do it, I think is what we're saying here. But Oliver, thank you again for your time today, and enjoy your family vacation.